Welcome to another episode of AI Health Leaders, where we dive into the future of healthcare with AI innovators, tech founders, and industry pioneers.
I'm your host, Rahul Varshney. This episode is brought to you by Arcania, a custom software development company trusted by healthcare organizations for over 14 years. Whether you're building AI-powered tools, EHR systems, or patient apps, Arcania helps you move fast and stay compliant. Now, today's guest is someone who brings a refreshingly real-world perspective to all the hype around AI. He's led engineering and product teams across startups and large companies and knows what it takes to actually bring innovation to life. I'm excited to welcome Bill Gibson to the podcast. Bill, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the elephant in the room, AI. It's in every investor memo, every product roadmap, and honestly, sometimes just thrown into pitch decks because, it sounds impressive. But not every product also needs AI, at least not right away. And you've been pretty vocal about avoiding the sparkle trap, so to speak. From your perspective, when does it actually make sense to bring AI into a product, and how should founders think about timing and focus when AI is being hyped from virtually every direction that you can think of?
Yeah. And I've seen it over the last 2 to 4 years of, you need to get AI into the product. And you go, okay, well, that's great. I hear what you're saying. I think it's important. It's definitely something that we need to show how to do. But, my feeling on this has been, it needs to actually have relevance. It needs to have an anchor in the product. It needs to have an anchor into the user experience, that it becomes something that feels natural and it makes an easy transition. It's sticking in a chatbot and saying, oh, well, you can ask it anything isn't helpful, right? That's not relevant. And it's a jarring experience to have what's probably a nice graphical interface have this, chat terminal, old school 80s style. Oh, I'm going to type some stuff and something's coming back and I'm going to type some more things. That's useful. It's great for a programmer. It's not great for, somebody in e-commerce or somebody trying to get their healthcare managed, some disease state taken care of. So I think the thing is to really be thinking about this. How is it going to fix the existing user business, problem that your application is there to do? How do you extend that? How do you make it smarter, better, more automated, instead of just going, okay, I'm going to shove some AI in here somewhere? So I think it's important to be thinking about it as it's just another tool in the way that you work.
So even when AI is the right fit, it's not just a plug-and-play situation, right? So there's a lot that needs to happen behind the scenes, such as what models to use, how to handle sensitive data, especially when it comes to certain industries, and making sure your team doesn't, unknowingly expose customer IPs. And obviously, it's not the most glamorous side of AI, but it's really the kind of stuff that can make or break trust, between your product or yourself and the users. What are some of the overlooked, but extremely critical considerations when implementing AI responsibly? So especially for startups that are dealing with, user data, proprietary workflows, there are compliances as well, in heavily regulated industries.
Well, even heavily regulated industries, if you've got users in Europe, you've got to deal with GDPR or California's version of GDPR. So privacy is something we are all having to worry about. And it would be pretty easy to just stick some, LLM in there, and all of a sudden, there's going to be, leakage of that personal information where you don't want it. Some of those are easy. Some of them are harder. Okay, well, how do I separate or put in firewalls in between, say, different customers and their experience, so that somebody's proprietary keywords aren't showing up in competitors' AI generated reports or summaries or the like. So part of this is thinking, okay, where do the separations need to go? Where what is the regulation, and are there pieces of that regulation that bar or cause some issues with something like AI, which is non-deterministic. So one of the things I think people sometimes forget about is that the same prompts won't give you the same outputs tomorrow that they did today, because either they saw the prompts from before and that's all part of that same audit trail, and so the answer coming back is going to be different, or it's learned and now it has a slightly different tuning of the model, so you're going to get different output. So coming from a world of statistics and the statistics in life sciences, that deterministic model is really important. That number needs to be the same today as it was yesterday and tomorrow. Otherwise, someone's going to go, how can you say that's the right answer? So you need to be thinking about what is it that you're doing, and are there ways to essentially pin or make certain pieces of this deterministic versus dynamic. And then how do you unchain that to get the latest learnings and so forth? Do you make that part of your regular release cycle so that you get the updates, you get those learnings, but you don't get them automatically all the time?
Right. And, one of the traps that we see in startups is, reaching for the flashiest model, right? Like a large language model, when something simpler would have actually got the job done even better, for that matter. And there's this assumption that, more advanced just means more value, but often that's really not the case. And how do you think, founders should go about choosing the right type of AI for the problem that they're trying to solve? Like, are there signals or criteria that help make that kind of decision and the less overwhelming?
Well, I would start with founders typically have already had to make decisions around technology or around approach, models, business model, where simpler is better, right? It's an old startup idea of mine or a group of people, including me, was to sell computer cycles back before there was Bitcoin and all the rest, sort of easily mining or using spare cycles. And so we were like, oh yeah, we'll go ahead and do this, and but what happened is that business model was really complicated. We had to create this market for buying computer cycles and making use of those, and providing some sort of value to the people that were giving those spare cycles to this process. So then there's like really two different customers or two different stakeholders. You had to satisfy both of them, and it became really complicated very quickly. Those same decisions that we've been as entrepreneurs having to make for forever are still valid when it comes to the technology of AI and large language models. We need to be thinking: is this the solution that fits well? Does it provide enough complexity to do the job, but not so much that it's going to be this nightmare to maintain or this nightmare to set up? Nobody's going to understand it. Those are the same questions. I don't think that there's new heuristics or new metrics. You still have to use the same metrics that you use with a critical eye everywhere else.
Well, and then there's also the challenge of usability, right? So you can have the most powerful model in the world, but if the end user doesn't even understand, what it's doing, or much worse, doesn't even trust it, that entire model can really fall flat. And especially in health, that trust gap can be huge, depending on what kind of problem that you're solving. So what's your approach to designing, AI-powered features that feel more intuitive to real users, and especially in health or wellness contexts where, the stakes are also very high?
Yeah. We all seem to have a bit of, a critical eye towards AI, especially when it comes to something that is important, or a mistake is going to cause big problems. So I think we need to be clear if we're going to use an agent or we're going to be using some sort of, automated complex model, that we need to make it clear that that's what's happened. This is a result. As I look at Apple's intelligence, and on my phone it tells me, oh well, here's the these eight, the summarization of these eight notifications, and it's clearly stating this came through Apple Intelligence. So I think one of the things we need to do is make sure that we're differentiating that this is a non-deterministic, and we'll say to some degree, even though it's production thing, it's still experimental. We need to be showing that to people so that they understand and they take a little bit more of a critical view of it, and they don't just go, oh yeah, of course, I'm going to do that. And that may help us here, where we're not promising that this thing is providing all the right answers. If it's a medical app, this AI isn't a doc. So it's if it's the doc saying, hey, this is what you need to do, most of us go, okay. We may sort of wonder, okay, well, what does that mean, and how does that fit with my internal health model? But for the most part, we're going to assume that that's good. And there's a trust there's a good trust there, because we've probably seen this person, they've been taking care of us. That AI doesn't have that level of trust, and so we need to make sure that no one equates those two things as being the same. So that's where I would go with it at the moment. There may be a future time where we don't have to worry about it the same way, because the answers are always good, but right now, it's, if there's one weird outlier in the data, then eventually it's going to run across it and give you some real zinger of an answer that doesn't make any sense, and it's going to bust that trust.
And especially in healthcare, trust is pretty much everything. And how do you build sort of transparency into AI workflows? Is it about explainability, confidence scores, or showing the source data, or is it like something totally different?
Well, depending on that application, where did it come from, or here's the trust, or our confidence score. I think those are good things to put in there. But the other is just making sure that you clearly differentiate that this is not a doc, this is not a nurse, this is not a medical practitioner, this is an AI. They're using good curated training data to put this together, because we wouldn't want to just have it be the internet telling them what is healthy. But that we want to differentiate it that way, so that the user, the consumer of this content, can tell the difference, that they're not mistaking the AI for a doc or the doc for the AI.
Right. That makes sense. And, most early stage startups don't necessarily have, massive proprietary data sets, right? But at the same time, you keep hearing that owning your own data is the greatest thing and must have. But how do you sort of train or fine tune models when your sample size itself is, either very tiny or noisy? And especially when it comes to, startups that are innovating in let's say a newer space. What have you seen, which would work for startups when they want to build AI capabilities, but don't have that scale of data that potentially bigger players do, especially when they're competing in that space? Is synthetic data legit? Do they want to look for partnerships, or what could be a realistic option for them?
Well, buying data may be a realistic option there. There's certainly lots of medical marketplace data that you can get. I think about some of this, and granted, it's now been a few years, but I think about the MD Anderson, IBM Watson experiment, where they were going to cure cancer because they were going to take all of MD Anderson's cancer data and they were going to push it through the Watson model and come out with clear answers. That AI model isn't clearly still winning today, but if we think about that was a huge amount of data that they were able to push through. Not the same kind of models that we have now for AI, but they were unable to cure any cancer. They were unable to really get those direct signals out of that data. So we need to be kind of careful about what we think the AI is going to do for us, um, as well as what kind of data do we need in order to do that. I think that's a good thing to have in the back of your mind. Okay, well, what am I going to have the AI to do? Even something as huge as that couldn't cure cancer. Let's be careful what we think we're going to do with the AI. And if we say, oh well, a billion health records isn't going to be enough for me to get the signals I need, maybe we need to change the business model. But that's not to say that we can't have reasonable AI results, right? They just can't be that grandiose. You know, can I have an AI that reminds someone who's forgetful on their drug, taking their medicine on a daily basis? Can we get an AI that knows when best to nudge them? Yes, that's probably something that we can do. And that doesn't take, billions and billions of health records. It's some fairly basic, understanding of patterns of people, and also, some heuristics that fit with that. And AI should be really good at being an agent for that kind of work. So I think some of this is really choosing your problem, or choosing which piece of your problem you want to go after, than how much data do I really need.
The other aspect, one is that the other is really on the building for future from the architecture point of view, right? So, and the context is that the pace at which, as we all see, AI is evolving, is wild, right? The models are getting better every month, every quarter. APIs change. What you may be, as a startup that you may be building today, could very much be obsolete 6 months from now, what you build upon. And that's really tough for any startup that's trying to move fast, build solutions that are more sustainable. In that, how would you approach sort of a long-term architecture when the entire landscape is changing so fast from the AI perspective?
Right. My first reaction to that is the same as we do with any other sort of replaceable commodity within our products, is we abstract it out. I look at, been playing around with, a couple of different coding IDEs, Cursor, and also more recently Windsurf. Both of them allow you to choose, in some cases, a dozen different, AI, platforms to do the actual work. So, I think one of the things we need to be thinking about here as, an architecture of what we want to work on, is that the assumption is these models and, the underlying, support for them is changing still very rapidly. Don't pin yourself to a specific one. Use one to get you to move forward and get you to understand, but understand that you're probably going to have to iterate it in addition to everything else, and that you don't control that release cycle and you don't control what comes next. So make sure that you've got that fairly abstracted out.
That's interesting. Shifting gears a little bit, and talking a little bit about the leadership side of things, especially when it comes to technology. And you've had a front row seat to, many different phases of growth, right? So everything from building in a brand new space to leading teams in well-defined, mature markets as well. And the kind of leadership that's needed in each of these scenarios is also very different. How do you approach tech leadership differently depending on the maturity of the company? And what advice do you have for founders that are hiring their first technical leader, for instance?
Actually, in one sense, I don't see them as, they may feel different, but, I'm going to push that those large mature markets should be thinking more entrepreneurially, if that's a word. They should be thinking about how to, upset and move and push that market from complacency into something that's more dynamic, or somebody's eventually going to swoop in there and take, eat their lunch. So I disagree that it's wholly different. I do agree that there is a sort of feeling that that startup is usually faster, 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 more, more, more. I need a million new features next week. Where an established place, look, you already have a working thing that people are happy to use, and so that time pressure is a little bit different. And I would say that the risk there is that you relax and don't continue to push. For the startups, that need for I need everything and I need it tomorrow, it's really important to understand what is that true minimal viable thing that you can at least get a first few pilots in to then bootstrap you into a minimal viable general release product. And you should be shooting for much, much smaller scale things than I know I've wanted to push for in the past. Is that you really are trying to start with that really good core, that's something people can say, yeah, Bill, you made value for me. This solves at least a piece to the problem. It's enough to use, and build on that, so that actually you're trying to switch that around, where that entrepreneurial space is a little bit more like that established market. In the established market, you want to be more pushy.
Right. And when it comes to the same early stage startups, right? So one of the things that trips them up is really the sheer number of decisions that they have to make about the tech stack.
Yep.
When you're starting out and building something from the ground up, everything's a blank slate. And then that can either be empowering or even paralyzing, right? So depending on the decisions you have to make. And you've described it as making an overwhelming number of arbitrary decisions that somehow become permanent. How do you really help teams make smart early decision when there's so much ambiguity? And how do you also avoid falling into the trap of overcomplicating them, especially when it's too soon, right? When you're just about to building your first product.
So, there's a couple of pitfalls there. Number one, most likely the problem you think you're solving is not going to be the real problem in a year. So, accept that up front. Try to, navigate through and limit the amount of complex solutions you're trying to provide. You're not going to get 100%, and accept and admit that up front. There's going to be things you need to make a U-turn on. There's going to be, potentially, deep architectural changes that you're going to have to make, 18 months or 2 years into your effort, just because you just didn't know what you didn't know. And you didn't know what questions to ask to figure it out. And we need to accept that and build with the understanding that this is likely not 100% of the core infrastructure that we're going to build the company on and rely on for the next decade. So, part of this is light and quick early on as best you can. Try not to build so much of the, this would be really good infrastructure to go with it. With that, though, I would say don't skimp on automated testing. Don't skimp on unit testing. Don't skimp on the things that allow you to know that the code that you do have is good and solid, because you are going to have to build on that. If you have all that in place, it does mean you can rely on and lean on those things heavily to iterate quickly, try new things as quickly as you can, because you can ship or get new features out a whole lot faster. And it does make it better. So that discipline early is good, but you've got to keep that discipline up as you go along.
That makes sense. And finally, also, the other challenges, especially again, talking about these early stage companies and the challenge that they have to deal with, is not having enough hands on deck. So cash is limited. Contractors can really help you move faster, but not everything can be outsourced at the same time. And that balance can really be tricky to strike for an early stage company, especially when the product is still, evolving. What would be your framework for deciding what to outsource versus what to keep in-house, especially when you're building something, whether it's innovative or even experimental at the earlier stages?
Yeah. It's a hard one. I've made the wrong decisions on this before. So, part of this is a pain of past experiences. One of the things I would look at is early on, you may have no staff. So, to move forward at all means you're going to have to outsource almost everything. Don't outsource the strategy. Don't outsource the core requirements. Don't outsource the architecture itself. You're going to have to control those. Only you, the expert, or your team, the small team that you have that are the experts in this, or quickly becoming the experts in this, you're the only ones that can make those critical decisions. And then once you get past that, look at it as a hierarchy of needs. What are the most important things? What are the things that are the differentiators and the things that set your service, your solution, your product out from everybody else, special sauce? Those need to be built in-house. All the sort of have to have features. Number one, you should be questioning every one of those, right? So, if it's, I've got to have these 18 other features because everybody else has them. Those are things you should be questioning. But if you can't get around them, those are totally the things that you outsource. Those you can say, it needs to work like this other thing. Just, essentially replicate what you see there is a whole lot easier to get outsourced than the new thing that you're trying to make that makes you special.
That's excellent. Well, and with that, it's a wrap. Thank you so much for being on the podcast and sharing so much insights, from your experience.
It was a pleasure. I enjoyed it.